Hey y'all, Dr. Keisha Green here, and I wanted to welcome you to the second lesson of the Culturally Responsive Teaching 101 course. This lesson will center around the topics of equity and inclusion. In this lesson, we will go over what equity is, what inclusion is, as well as three strategies that can aid you with ensuring that your practice is centered around equity and inclusion being present in the classroom. By the end of this lesson, learners should be able to define what equity and inclusion means, connect the information gained to their own teaching practice, describe three equity and inclusion strategies, and evaluate their own teaching practice and understand how to grow it to be more centered around equity and inclusion. We will begin this lesson by talking about equity. I want you to pause and think about what you currently know about equity. How is equity defined, or what does equity mean? And what does an equitable school or classroom environment look like? One key aspect is that equity does not mean equality. With equality, everyone is provided the same materials or the same support. For example, in the classroom, the teacher might provide each student with the same pencil, paper, or learning materials. Indeed, equality might seem like a great idea because each student would have the same things. However, when students are provided equal support or materials, it could mean that their individual needs will not be met, and it can also mean that barriers, either cultural or learning barriers, that are in the way and preventing them from accessing learning, might not actually be adequately addressed. When thinking about why it is important for students to be treated equitably and not equally, let's look at an example and look at Miss Sarah's first grade class. The demographics of the class are 10 boys and 10 girls. 5 students are Black, 2 students are Hispanic, 1 student is Asian, and the remainder are white. Meanwhile, 6 students have individualized education programs or IEPs, and 2 students speak English as a second language or are English language learners, also referred to as ELLs. Additionally, 3 of the students with IEPs receive occupational therapy and demonstrate delays with writing and fine motor skills. If Ms. Sarah were to teach each of her students equally by providing all the students with the same learning materials and supports, then she will not succeed in meeting or addressing the learning needs of all the students. Consequently, to aid each student with being successful in their own learning, Ms. Sarah will need to put in place accommodations and or modifications based on the individual needs of each of the students. Accommodations are defined as any alterations that are made to the accessibility of the assignment or the exam or the work activity, including accessing learning materials through alterations. Those alterations can include larger font being used or colored paper being used, or students having extended time on those assignments. Accommodations also include environmental accessibility through the classroom environment, such as preferential seating or equipment for the student to use that would allow them to have easier access to the learning activities or the school environment. Examples of those environmental accessibility accommodations would be accessible scissors, augmentative learning devices, rotating cushion seats, or many others. Meanwhile, modifications are defined as changes that are made to the actual curriculum, lesson, or assignment, including changes in the learning expectations of the students. In the case of Miss Sarah's class, for the students who might demonstrate delays with fine motor skills, accommodations that might be put into place are picture cards to allow those students to respond to questions, or for the students to use magnetic letters to write words during writing time. An example of a modification might involve adjusting the writing expectations for these students. Instead of being expected to write one sentence, Miss Sarah might have a beginning expectation or goal for these students to create pre-writing strokes, which are lines or squiggles, and then work with that student to reach a later goal of independently writing one letter. Meanwhile, when addressing the learning needs of the ELL students, accommodations could include the use of visuals such as pictures to accompany the English words and to aid the students during learning activities. For the ELL students, modifications might include providing small group or one-on-one instruction that is geared around supporting these students with developing and expanding their English vocabulary. With these small changes, Ms. Sarah can meet the needs of the diverse learners in her classroom. The implementation of such accommodations and modifications also means that the students are not being treated equally, but rather they are being treated equitably. This is an important distinction when it comes to addressing the needs of the students in the classroom. To add to your understanding of accommodations and modifications, in front of you, you will see a chart that at the top lists the definitions and understandings of accommodations and of modifications, and at the bottom includes examples of accommodations and examples of modifications. Examples of accommodations might be that students are given books that are printed in larger font, or that students might be able to type out responses on a computer instead of being required to write them with pen and paper. Examples of modifications might be that a specific task or assignment is broken up or chunked up into smaller sections or parts for the student, or they might be required to write one sentence or one word depending on their respective skill level. Simply put, equity is described as treating people fairly. As illustrated by Ms. Sarah's class, equity does not mean that all students are treated equally, or even that students are provided duplicate resources. Rather, all students have their individual learning needs met through the implementation of necessary accommodations or modifications. By doing this, it works to ensure that each student has a fair chance of receiving a quality academic experience that will allow them to reach their fullest potential. Again, remember it is important to understand that equity does not mean equality. This means using a one size fits all approach does not ensure equity. Instead, educators should take the time to learn the individual needs of each student so that supports, accommodations, or modifications, and any tools that might be required are put into place that will aid the student with being successful throughout their educational journey. Whether it be in the school community or the classroom, students need to feel welcomed and wanted. Educators can accomplish this through ensuring their classroom is centered around inclusion. Inclusion is viewed as students having increased participation in the learning environment and decreased exclusion from accessing the learning materials or overall curriculum. In the classroom setting, inclusion means that all students are offered an opportunity to be a part of the larger classroom community. This might mean for some students, they might require additional supports, accommodations, or modifications in order to be made to feel as a part of the larger group. For inclusion to successfully exist in a classroom setting, educators need to understand the individual needs of each student. Let's go back to Miss Sarah's classroom. Again, the demographics of the class are as follows. There are 10 boys, 10 girls, 5 students are Black, 2 students are Hispanic, 1 student is Asian, and the remainder are white. 6 students have IEPs, and 2 students are ELL students. 3 of the students with IEPs receive OT and demonstrate delays with writing and fine motor skills. For now, we will focus on the 3 students that demonstrate delays with their fine motor skills. Being that each student demonstrates a different ability level with their fine motor skills, Ms. Sarah cannot implement a one-size-fits-all type of teaching strategy, or just give these 3 students all the same learning materials and expect the same results from them. To ensure these students are truly included, Ms. Sarah should take the time to meet with each student and to assess their individual abilities. She could also work with the OT, the occupational therapist, to create accommodations or modifications that can be implemented in the class to allow the student to fully participate in the lessons or in the respective learning activities. By taking the time to understand the individual needs of the students, Ms. Sarah will work towards ensuring each student is able to be an equal part of the larger group and to ensure that the students are able to fully access all aspects of their learning experience. As an educator, it is important to keep in mind that for students to be offered a fair opportunity to be a part of the larger class, it might mean that students require accommodations or modifications to allow them to be comfortable or confident enough to truly be a part of the larger class. It is important to remember that just because a student is in the general education setting does not automatically guarantee that they are being included into that setting. Also, remember that just because all students are given the same materials, it does not mean that they are being treated fairly or in their best interest. With this in mind, let's learn 3 strategies that will aid you with ensuring that your practice will center around establishing an equitable and inclusive learning environment for all. The first strategy is to learn and acknowledge the individual learning needs of each student. Students tend to move at different speeds when grasping new knowledge or arriving at developmental milestones, and students also tend to hold various learning styles. When looking back at Ms. Sarah's class, all of the students may not exhibit the standard expectations that have been placed on first graders. Some students might be exhibiting skills that are delayed, while others might be exhibiting on target or advanced skills. Miss Sarah might have some first grade students who learn best when presented with visual materials for learning supports, and other students who might learn best when they are presented with tangible or hands on learning materials. In ensuring that equity and inclusion is at the forefront of her teaching practice, Miss Sarah could take the time to learn and acknowledge the individual learning needs of each of her students. In the future, I encourage you to also take the time to learn the individual learning needs of your students. In front of you, you will see a checklist that you can use to understand what the potential learning needs of your students might be. For now, look over the list and gain an understanding of some of the aspects that you might want to understand when trying to better identify and acknowledge the learning needs of your students. Educators should take the time to understand the various learning styles of their students, the various level of content mastery their students hold, as well as understanding where each student is with meeting the respective expectations that have been put forth. When thinking about learning activities, educators should implement activities and use materials that work to meet the learning styles of all of their students. When working with students who might be below content mastery level, educators should alter the expectations and meet the students where they are, and then find ways to assist the students with meeting the respective developmental or grade level goals. With this in mind, we're going to look at the second strategy. The second strategy for promoting equity and inclusion is to identify any accommodations or modifications a student might require. After an educator identifies the learning needs for each student, they should find ways to meet or address the individual learning needs of these students, which may call for them to implement potential accommodations or modifications. Educators should take the time to think about accommodations, modifications, supports, classroom environment changes, or resources that might be necessary to implement in order to meet the individual learning needs of students. When working in the classroom in the future, I encourage you to use the checklist in front of you to identify any accommodations or modifications that your students might require. Please take the time now to go over the checklist and gain an understanding of what it entails. When looking to implement accommodations and modifications, there might be trial and error learning that might take place. Educators should take the time to try out different learning materials or to set varied, altered learning goals for students, and be sure to regularly assess the progress of the students with the implementation of these accommodations or modifications. Now, let's look at the third and final strategy. The third strategy is to ensure that accommodations and or modifications are implemented consistently and that all students' learning needs are regularly being assessed and addressed accordingly. For accommodations and modifications to be successful, it means that they are being implemented consistently and regularly. Students are growing and changing constantly. Therefore, their learning needs are also rapidly changing. Accommodations and modifications that might have been appropriate at the beginning of the school year may not remain appropriate by the middle or towards the end of the school year. It is important to regularly assess or collect data around the implementation of the accommodations or modifications and to see how they are impacting the progress of the student. Through uncovering the progress of the student, it will allow the educator to better see if the accommodations or modifications being implemented are actually benefiting the student. If it turns out through regular assessment that the student is not making adequate progress, then the educators will be able to adapt the accommodations or modifications so that they become more appropriate in meeting the respective learning needs of the student. Returning to Miss Sarah's class, the students with fine motor delays have been given the opportunity to practice their writing skills daily during a small group session. By the middle of the school year, Miss Sarah found that all of these students were now able to write letters independently and were able to write a three-letter word. After gaining this insight around the progress that the students have made, Miss Sarah modified the expectations of the students by supporting them with the goal to write a sentence using three words. Miss Sarah also recognized that the daily small group benefited the students and had assisted with the students making progress. As a result, she planned to continue the small group sessions. These students had demonstrated more confidence and engagement during larger group sections as a result of having that independent time with Miss Sarah during the small group sessions. Miss Sarah made it a point to ensure that accommodations and or modifications were implemented consistently, and she took the time to regularly assess and remain aware of the learning needs of her students. Now, I encourage you to take time to pause and think about your own teaching practice. How will you ensure that the learning environment you create centers around equity and inclusion? On the next slide, you will find the references that were used to shape this lesson, and at the end of this video, you will find the discussion board number 3 question. So once you are done with your self-reflection, please continue on and be sure to answer the discussion board question in the comment section. I thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lesson video.